In 1902, the world's empires discovered something more powerful than war. Treaties became their new weapons. Britain signed peace in South Africa, but formed an alliance in Tokyo. The United States ended its rebellion in the Philippines, only to seize control of Cuba's future. Russia promised to withdraw from Manchuria, a promise that would drag the world toward the first Great War of the century. This was the year bayonets were replaced by signatures, and every one of them carried the smell of gunpowder. These treaties would harden rival blocs and narrow diplomatic options so sharply that when crises came, war would become the path of least political resistance. The wars of the last decade had shown empires their limits. China's Boxer Rebellion had required 8 nations to suppress. South Africa's Boer farmers had resisted Britain's largest expeditionary force for 3 years. Filipino insurgents had forced America to create an entire colonial police system. Every victory had revealed how expensive control had become. 1902 was not a year to fight. It was a year to legalize power. Treaties, alliance frameworks, and protectorate laws replaced expeditionary campaigns. But these legal instruments were not peace. They were structural preparations for future wars. Every agreement signed in 1902 hardened spheres of influence, formalized rival blocs, and created obligations that would pull empires into conflicts they could not avoid. While treaties were signed across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the most dangerous military development of 1902 occurred not on battlefields, but in shipyards. Germany was building a navy designed to challenge the greatest maritime power in history. Since defeating Napoleon at Trafalgar in 1805, Britain had maintained unchallenged naval supremacy. This was not about prestige, it was about survival. Britain was an island nation that imported most of its food and raw materials. Without control of the shipping lanes, Britain would starve. British naval dominance also protected the empire. India, Australia, Canada, South Africa, Egypt, all connected to London through sea routes that British warships patrolled. If Britain lost control of the seas, the empire would fragment. Each colony would fall under the influence of whatever regional power controlled its adjacent waters. For nearly a century, no nation seriously challenged British naval supremacy. France and Russia had navies, but both were primarily land powers focused on continental borders. Neither could match Britain's shipbuilding capacity or naval tradition. Then Germany changed the calculation. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who became German emperor in 1888, believed Germany deserved a place in the sun. He wanted colonial territories and global influence comparable to Britain and France. But Germany faced a problem. Most valuable colonial territories were already claimed. Without a CTI-7 powerful navy, Germany could not project force beyond Europe to seize new territories or protect German commercial interests worldwide. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, appointed Secretary of State of the Imperial Naval Office in 1897, convinced Wilhelm that Germany needed a battle fleet. This fleet would not just consist of coastal defense ships, but ocean-going battleships capable of fighting Britain's Royal Navy. Tirpitz's logic was called risk theory. Germany did not need to build a navy larger than Britain's. That would be impossibly expensive. Instead, Germany needed a fleet large enough that destroying it would cost Britain so many ships that other powers like France or Russia could then defeat what remained of Britain's weakened navy. This was strategic blackmail. Tirpitz believed that if Germany built a sufficiently dangerous fleet, Britain would negotiate rather than fight. Britain would grant Germany colonial concessions, commercial advantages, and diplomatic respect rather than risk a naval war that might destroy British naval supremacy even in victory. In 1898, Germany passed the first naval law, authorizing construction of a modest fleet. In June 1900, while Britain was distracted by the Boer War, Germany passed the second naval law. This law doubled the fleet size from 19 to 38 battleships, to be built over 17 years from 1901 to 1917. Britain had initially treated these laws as manageable, But by 1902, the scale and systematic nature of German construction forced a fundamental reassessment. By 1902, German shipyards were working at full capacity. New battleships slid down slipways every few months. The German Navy was no longer a coastal defense force. It was becoming a fleet capable of challenging Britain in the North Sea. At first, Britain viewed German naval expansion as manageable. The Royal Navy was so large that a few German battleships seemed insignificant. But by 1902, British naval planners recognized something alarming. Germany's shipbuilding program was not reactive, it was systematic. The Second Naval Law included automatic replacement provisions. Every battleship would be replaced after 25 years. This meant that even if a future German government wanted to stop naval expansion, the law mandated continued construction. Germany was committing to permanent naval competition with Britain. More troubling was Germany's geographic position. Germany's naval bases were in the North Sea, directly across from Britain. France's navy was based in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, far from British home waters. Russia's navy was divided between the Baltic, mostly iced in winter, the Black Sea, blocked by Turkish straits, and the Pacific, impossibly distant from Europe. Germany's North Sea fleet could concentrate against Britain's home islands within hours. This meant Germany did not need a larger navy than Britain's global fleet. It only needed a navy larger than whatever British forces could rapidly concentrate in home waters. By 1902 to 1903, Admiralty planning increasingly viewed Germany as the principal naval contingency. The formal Selborne Memorandum would follow in 1904, articulating what had become clear through German naval construction patterns and strategic positioning. Admiral John Fisher, who would become First Sea Lord in 1904, already identified Germany as Britain's principal naval enemy during planning discussions. Britain's response was immediate and systematic. Britain's long-standing two-power standard, maintaining a navy equal to the next two largest navies combined, remained official policy. But from 1902, planning and deployments concentrated against Germany. Preliminary planning for fleet concentration began in 1902 to 1903. The formal reorganization would take effect under Fisher in 1904. The Channel Fleet expanded to over a dozen battleships, positioned to intercept any German sortie from North Sea ports. Naval budgets increased. Shipyard capacity expanded. German shipyards laid keels. British shipyards responded. Every German battleship launched required British construction of more battleships to maintain the ratio. The arms race became self-sustaining. Each side built because the other was building, neither willing to concede naval inferiority. This competition was fundamentally different from colonial wars. Colonial conflicts involved professional soldiers fighting indigenous forces with inferior technology, expensive but manageable. The Anglo-German naval arms race involved the world's two most advanced industrial economies, competing to build weapons systems specifically designed to annihilate each other's fleets. Battleships cost millions of pounds each. They required massive industrial infrastructure, steel mills, shipyards, armament factories, trained crews. Every battleship Britain built meant fewer resources for colonial defense, social programs, or economic investment. The same was true for Germany. But neither side could stop. For Britain, stopping meant accepting German naval parity, which meant losing the naval supremacy that protected British food imports and held the empire together. For Germany, stopping meant accepting permanent subordination to British maritime power, which meant abandoning dreams of colonial expansion and global influence. Every other British strategic decision in 1902 flowed from the German naval threat. The Anglo-Japanese alliance, signed in January 1902, made sense because Britain could not simultaneously contain Russia in Asia and Germany in European waters. This was Britain's first peacetime military alliance since the early 19th century, marking the end of splendid isolation. By allying with Japan, Britain delegated Asian concerns to a capable regional power, freeing British naval forces to concentrate in home waters against Germany. The Treaty of Vereeniging, ending the Boer War in May 1902, reflected Britain's urgent need to redeploy forces. Every soldier in South Africa was a soldier unavailable for European defense. The Boer War's £200 million cost strained the treasury and forced difficult trade-offs, even as naval spending would soon climb again due to German pressure. Britain's shift toward administrative efficiency in colonies reflected the same calculation. Colonial wars drained resources needed for the naval competition. Britain could no longer afford expensive expeditions when shipyard production determined great power status. The Anglo-German naval arms race that began in earnest in 1902 would consume both nations' resources for 12 years. It would drive Britain to abandon its traditional diplomatic isolation and seek European allies, leading to the Anglo-French Entente of 1904 and the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. Those alliances would create the bloc system that turned a Balkan assassination in 1914 into a world war. When World War I began in 1914, it would not be caused by colonial disputes in Africa or Asia. It would begin in the Balkans. But the alliance systems that transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe were forged in response to the German naval threat that became explicit in Britain's strategic assessments during 1902 to 1903. The battleships built in 1902 were not just weapons, they were commitments. Every ship laid down was a statement that neither side would back down, and those commitments, once made, could not be unmade without appearing weak. The arms race of 1902 set both nations on a path toward confrontation that would be almost impossible to escape. On June 30th, 1902, French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse and Italian Foreign Minister Giulio Prinetti reached a confidential understanding, an exchange of notes, in which each acknowledged the other's ambitions. Italy would not oppose French moves in Morocco. France would not oppose Italian intervention in Ottoman Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya. This was not a formal treaty with legal ratification, but a diplomatic understanding that would prove just as binding. On paper, this looked like practical diplomacy. Two Mediterranean powers dividing North African spheres of influence to avoid conflict. But this secret agreement would set in motion a chain of events leading directly to World War I. Morocco occupied a strategic position at the entrance to the Mediterranean. The Strait of Gibraltar, only 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Any power controlling Morocco's northern coast could threaten shipping. Through the strait, France already controlled Algeria since 1830 and Tunisia since 1881. Morocco was the last independent North African state between French Algeria and Spanish territories. France wanted Morocco to complete its North African empire and secure its Mediterranean position. But Germany also had interests in Morocco. German merchants traded with Moroccan ports. German investors had railway concessions. And strategically, Germany feared French expansion would create a chain of French territories from West Africa through North Africa to Syria, encircling Germany's potential colonial aspirations. The 1902 understanding made Italy's later invasion diplomatically possible, even though it would not act until 1911. France gained confidence to pursue Morocco without worrying about Italian opposition. Italy, which had colonial ambitions of its own in North Africa, agreed not to challenge France in Morocco in exchange for French support for Italian expansion into Libya when the opportunity arose. In 1905, France began moving to establish a protectorate over Morocco. French officials negotiated with the Moroccan Sultan to grant France control over Moroccan finances, police, and foreign policy. Germany objected. Kaiser Wilhelm II personally visited Tangier in March 1905 and delivered a speech supporting Moroccan independence. This was not about Morocco itself. It was about German prestige. Germany demanded an international conference to discuss Morocco's future, challenging France's assumption that it could act unilaterally. The result was the First Moroccan Crisis. For months, Europe teetered on the edge of war. Britain supported France. Russia, France's ally, was weak after defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, but supported France diplomatically. Germany stood largely alone. The crisis ended with the Algeciras Conference in 1906, which granted France special rights in Morocco, but required international oversight. Germany had prevented France from complete annexation, but at the cost of deepening the divide between Germany and the France-Britain bloc. In 1911, France sent troops to occupy Fez, Morocco's capital, claiming it needed to protect European residents from tribal unrest. Germany responded by sending the gunboat SMS Panther to Agadir, a Moroccan port, in July 1911. This triggered the Second Moroccan Crisis. Germany demanded compensation in the French Congo in exchange for accepting French control of Morocco. Britain backed France, with Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordering the British fleet to prepare for war. Germany eventually accepted territorial concessions in the Congo, and France established a protectorate over Morocco in 1912. But the two Moroccan crises had hardened the division of Europe into hostile blocs. Germany viewed Britain and France as aligned against German interests. France and Britain viewed Germany as aggressive and expansionist. The crises demonstrated that colonial disputes could trigger European wars, and that when they did, the alliance systems would automatically engage. The 1902 Franco-Italian understanding gave France the confidence to pursue Morocco aggressively, because it knew Italy would not oppose it. That confidence translated into the policies that triggered both crises. Italy's side of the 1902 agreement, freedom to take Libya, seemed less consequential at the time. Libya was poor, mostly desert, sparsely populated, and firmly under Ottoman control. Few observers expected Italy to act on this provision, but in July 1911, during the Second Moroccan Crisis, Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti recognized an opportunity. France was consolidating control over Morocco with British support. If Italy did not act soon, the moment would pass. European attention was focused on Morocco. The Ottoman Empire appeared weak. Russia, Britain, and France were all encouraging Italy to move. In September 1911, Italy issued an ultimatum to the Ottoman Empire demanding withdrawal from Libya within 48 hours. When the Ottomans refused, Italy declared war on September 29, 1911. The Italo-Turkish War lasted 13 months. Italy quickly occupied Libya's coast, but faced fierce resistance from Ottoman officers and Arab tribal fighters in the interior. Italy deployed 100,000 troops, a massive force for what was supposed to be a quick colonial conquest. Italy also occupied the Dodecanese Islands in the Aegean Sea to pressure the Ottomans. The war ended in October 1912 with the Treaty of Vereeniging. Italy gained Libya, though Ottoman officers continued supporting resistance. The Ottomans, facing financial exhaustion and threatened with permanent loss of the Dodecanese, accepted defeat. The Ottoman Empire's defeat in Libya had catastrophic consequences. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had been called the sick man of Europe, weak, declining, and losing territories to nationalist movements. But until 1911, the empire had avoided total defeat in a war with a European power. Libya changed the perception. If Italy, not even considered a first-ranked military power, could defeat the Ottoman Empire, what could stop more powerful states? Balkan states had watched the Italo-Turkish War closely. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro all had territorial ambitions in Ottoman-controlled Macedonia and Thrace. They had been restrained by fear of Ottoman military power and concern that great powers would oppose Balkan expansion. Ottoman defeat in Libya removed both restraints. In October 1912, the same month the Italo-Turkish War ended, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro formed the Balkan League and launched the First Balkan War against the Ottoman Empire. Within 2 months, Balkan forces had conquered almost all Ottoman territories in Europe. The Ottoman Empire lost Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, and most of its European territories except Constantinople, and a small defensive perimeter around the capital. The First Balkan War triggered the Second Balkan War in 1913, when former allies fought over how to divide conquered territories. Serbia emerged strengthened, emboldened, and determined to unite all South Slavs under Serbian leadership, including Slavs in Austria-Hungary's Bosnian territories. Austrian fear of Serbian expansion, Russian support for Slavic nationalism, German backing for Austria, and French alliance with Russia, all the elements that would explode in 1914, were set in motion by the Ottoman weakness revealed in Libya. Franco-Italian understanding in June 1902 led to France gaining confidence to pursue Morocco. This resulted in French expansion in Morocco. Germany challenged France at Tangier in 1905, leading to the First Moroccan Crisis. France and Britain aligned against Germany, isolating Germany. France occupied Fez in 1911. In the same year, Germany sent a gunboat to Agadir, which triggered the Second Moroccan Crisis. Britain committed to France against Germany. Franco-Italian understanding in June 1902 also allowed Italy the freedom to take Libya. Italy invaded Libya in September 1911, marking the start of the Italo-Turkish War. The Ottoman weakness was revealed, and Balkan states sensed an opportunity. The First Balkan War began in October 1912, resulting in the Ottoman Empire losing European territories. Serbian nationalism was emboldened, leading to Serbian ambitions in Bosnia. Austria feared South Slavic unity. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand occurred in June 1914. Austria demanded concessions from Serbia. Russia supported Serbia, while Germany backed Austria. France honored its alliance with Russia, and Britain honored its entente with France, leading to World War I. The 1902 secret agreement between France and Italy drew a direct line from a diplomatic document to the outbreak of World War I. Two powers divided North African spheres of influence on paper and called it diplomacy. Within 12 years, that agreement had triggered two major crises and a war that destabilized the Balkans and set the stage for global catastrophe. On January 30, 1902, Britain and Japan signed a formal military alliance. For the first time in modern history, a European great power formally recognized an Asian nation as an equal partner. This was revolutionary. European powers had spent the previous century treating Asian nations as targets for colonization or subordination. China had been carved into spheres of influence. India was a British colony. Southeast Asia was divided among European empires. Even Japan had been forced to open its ports to Western trade, at gunpoint in 1854. But by 1902, Japan had transformed itself into a modern military power. Britain needed an ally in Asia because Russia posed a threat that Britain could not counter alone. After the Boxer Rebellion ended in 1900, foreign powers withdrew troops from China, except Russia. Russia kept well over 100,000 troops in Manchuria, China's northeastern provinces. Russia claimed this was a temporary occupation to protect Russian railways and restore order after the Boxer Crisis. Russia invested heavily in Manchurian railways. The Chinese Eastern Railway connected Russian Siberia to the Russian leased port of Port Arthur, which is modern-day Lushan. Russian officials stated that troops would withdraw once stability was restored. However, Russian troops did not withdraw. Instead, Russia built more fortifications, expanded railway infrastructure, and established deeper administrative control. Russian military governors ruled Manchurian cities. Russian police patrolled the streets. Russian officials collected taxes. Manchuria's strategic importance was clear. It bordered Russian Siberia to the north, giving Russia easy overland access. It controlled approaches to Korea, China's northern neighbor. Port Arthur, which Russia forced China to lease in 1898, provided Russia a warm water port in the Pacific. Unlike Russia's Baltic and Black Sea ports, Port Arthur did not freeze in winter and was not blocked by straits controlled by potential enemies. If Russia permanently controlled Manchuria, it would dominate Northeast Asia. Russian railways could move troops to Korea within days. Korea would face overwhelming military pressure from the north. China would lose effective sovereignty over its richest northeastern provinces. Britain opposed Russian expansion in Manchuria for both commercial and strategic reasons. British merchants had significant trade with China. British investors held railway concessions in China. Russian domination of Manchuria threatened British commercial interests throughout China. Strategically, Russia controlling Manchuria meant Russia controlling Korea. Russia controlling Korea created a potential Russian naval base facing Japan and threatened sea routes between China, Japan, and British colonies in Southeast Asia. However, Britain faced a fundamental problem. British power was naval, not continental. The Royal Navy dominated oceans, but Manchuria was landlocked. British warships could blockade Port Arthur, but they could not remove Russian troops from Manchuria's interior. Sending British armies to fight Russia in Manchuria was impossible. Britain was already overstretched. The Boer War required over 450,000 troops and cost £200 million. British forces garrisoned India, Egypt, South Africa, and territories worldwide. Britain could not afford another land war in Asia while simultaneously facing the German naval threat in Europe. Britain needed a partner, a regional power capable of fighting Russia on land in Northeast Asia. That power was Japan. Japan viewed Russian occupation of Manchuria as an existential threat. Japan fought China in 1894 to 1895, specifically to prevent any single power from dominating Korea. Japan's security doctrine held that Korea must remain either independent or under Japanese influence. Korea could never become a base for hostile powers, because Korea's position directly across from Japan meant any power controlling Korea could threaten the Japanese home islands. Russian occupation of Manchuria placed well over 100,000 Russian troops directly north of Korea. From Manchuria, Russia could move south into Korea with overwhelming force. Once Russia controlled Korea, Japan would be surrounded, with Russian territory to the west in Manchuria and Russian forces across the Korea Strait in Korea. Potential Russian naval bases would threaten Japanese coastlines. Japanese military planners understood that diplomatic protests would not remove Russia from Manchuria. Russia had demonstrated through its broken withdrawal promises that it would not leave voluntarily. The only question was whether Japan could fight Russia successfully. But Japan faced a problem similar to Britain's European alliances. Russia had a formal military alliance with France. If Japan attacked Russia, France might enter the war on Russia's side. If France joined Russia, Germany might support Russia to maintain the European balance of power. Japan could defeat Russia in Manchuria, and Japanese military leaders were confident of this. But Japan could not defeat Russia, plus France, plus potentially Germany. Japanese forces would be overwhelmed by simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. This was where the Anglo-Japanese alliance changed the calculation. The alliance committed Britain and Japan to maintain the independence and territorial integrity of China and Korea. If either nation went to war with a single power to defend these interests, the other would remain neutral. But if either fought two or more powers simultaneously, the other would enter the war as an ally. The target was obvious. If Japan fought Russia over Manchuria, Britain would remain neutral, as this was Japan's fight. But if France joined Russia, Britain would enter the war on Japan's side. This transformed the strategic situation completely. France could not risk war with Britain. Britain's navy could blockade French ports, destroy French overseas trade, threaten French colonies, and potentially land British forces in France itself. The French army was strong, but France was vulnerable to British naval power. Similarly, Germany would not challenge Britain without overwhelming reason. Germany was building a navy to compete with Britain, but in 1902, the German fleet was still far smaller than Britain's. Germany could not afford a naval war with Britain while its fleet was still under construction. The Anglo-Japanese alliance therefore served as a deterrent. It told Russia, "If you fight Japan alone, you are on your own. But if France or Germany joins you, Britain will intervene, and Britain's intervention will shift the entire balance of power against you." Before the alliance, Japanese leaders faced an impossible calculation. They could fight Russia and risk facing multiple European powers, or accept permanent Russian domination of Manchuria and eventually Korea. After the alliance, Japan knew it could fight Russia without fearing European intervention. British naval power would deter France and Germany. Japan would face Russia alone, and Japanese military planners believed Japan could win. The alliance did not prevent war. It made Japanese leaders willing to risk war because they now had European backing. Throughout 1902 and 1903, Japan accelerated military preparations. Shipyards built battleships. Arsenals produced ammunition. Officers planned invasion routes. Japan negotiated loans from British banks to finance the war. All the while, Russia continued building fortifications in Manchuria, moving more troops into position, and strengthening Port Arthur's defenses. The Anglo-Japanese alliance set a countdown. Japan would wait until its preparations were complete. Russia would delay until its own reinforcements arrived, and the Trans-Siberian Railway could move supplies more efficiently. But both sides were preparing for war, and the alliance ensured that when war came, it would be a bilateral conflict rather than a multilateral intervention. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. Japan's victory, shocking European powers who expected Russia to crush an Asian nation, was enabled by the Anglo-Japanese alliance that prevented European intervention. The alliance of January 1902 was Britain's first peacetime military alliance since the early 19th century. It marked Britain's abandonment of splendid isolation, the policy of avoiding continental entanglements. Britain had been forced to seek allies because it could not simultaneously counter Russia in Asia and Germany in Europe. This pattern would repeat. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, not a formal alliance, but an understanding that resolved colonial disputes and established diplomatic cooperation. In 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, similarly resolving colonial conflicts and establishing cooperation. These agreements were all responses to the German naval threat. Britain needed partners to manage regional challenges so it could concentrate resources against Germany. The alliance system that these agreements created, Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, aligned against Germany and Austria-Hungary, was the structure that transformed the 1914 assassination in Sarajevo into a world war. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of January 1902 was the first step in creating that fatal bloc system. On April 8, 1902, Russia signed the Russo-Chinese Manchurian Convention with China's Qing government. The agreement specified Russia's withdrawal from Manchuria in 3 phases over 18 months, beginning October 1902. Russian diplomats presented this as proof that Russia intended to restore Chinese sovereignty over Manchuria. The occupation was temporary. Order had been restored after the Boxer Rebellion. Russian troops would leave on schedule. No one believed them. Russia had spent 2 years building infrastructure in Manchuria. The Chinese Eastern Railway now connected Russian Siberia to Port Arthur through Manchurian territory. Branch lines extended to major Manchurian cities. Russian engineers had built stations, workshops, bridges, and administrative buildings along the entire route. Russian troops garrisoned cities throughout Manchuria. Russian military governors administered law. Russian police maintained order. Russian financial advisors influenced Manchurian economic policy. Russia had effectively occupied Manchuria in everything but name. Withdrawing would mean surrendering all these investments. The railways would fall back under Chinese control, or worse, become accessible to other foreign powers. British or Japanese merchants could use Russian-built railways to compete with Russian trade. Chinese officials could impose taxes and regulations on Russian commerce. More critically, withdrawing from Manchuria meant losing Port Arthur. Port Arthur was Russia's only warm-water Pacific port. Russia's Baltic ports froze in winter. Russia's Black Sea ports were blocked by Turkish straits that Britain could close. Port Arthur gave Russia year-round naval access to the Pacific. But Port Arthur could not be defended without controlling Manchuria. The port was at the southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, connected to Manchuria by a narrow isthmus. Defending Port Arthur required controlling the approaches through Manchuria. Withdraw from Manchuria, and Port Arthur became indefensible. Russian military planners had no intention of leaving Manchuria. The convention's evacuation schedule was diplomatic theater, a document to wave at international critics, while Russia continued consolidating control. Japanese officials understood immediately that Russia would not honor the convention. The evacuation schedule came and went. October 1902 arrived, the date for the first phase of withdrawal. Russian troops remained in position. Russia offered excuses: local instability, administrative delays, logistical challenges. Every month Russian troops remained. Russia's position strengthened. Russian engineers extended railways deeper into Manchuria. Russian fortifications around Port Arthur grew more. Formidable concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, minefields, fortified hills. Russian supply depots stockpiled ammunition, food, and military equipment. For Japan, delay meant strategic disadvantage. If Russia completed its railway network, it could move reinforcements from Siberia to Manchuria within days. The Russian population was 130 million. The Japanese population was 45 million. In a long war of attrition, Russia's greater population and industrial capacity might overwhelm Japan, but only if Russia could move forces quickly to the battlefront. As long as the Trans-Siberian Railway remained incomplete and single-tracked, Russia faced logistical challenges. Sending reinforcements from European Russia to Manchuria required a journey of over 5,000 miles along a railway that could only move one train at a time in each direction. Delays could be measured in weeks, but Russia was working to expand railway capacity. Every year of delay allowed Russia to build more track, add more sidings, improve logistics. Japan's window of opportunity was closing. Japanese military planners reached a conclusion. Diplomacy had failed. Russia would not leave Manchuria voluntarily. The Russo-Chinese Manchurian Convention was proof that Russia would sign agreements it had no intention of honoring. The only way to remove Russia from Manchuria was military force, and thanks to the Anglo-Japanese alliance signed 3 months before the convention, Japan could fight Russia without fearing European intervention. Throughout 1902 and 1903, Japan prepared methodically for war. The Japanese Diet authorized military budgets. Shipyards accelerated battleship construction. Arsenals produced rifles and artillery. The military high command refined invasion plans. Japanese diplomats negotiated loans from British and American banks to finance the coming war. Russia, meanwhile, continued building fortifications and railways, confident that European powers would not allow an Asian nation to challenge a European empire. The Russo-Chinese Manchurian Convention of April 1902 was not a step toward peace. It was the final confirmation that Russia would not leave Manchuria voluntarily. That realization eliminated the possibility of diplomatic resolution and made war inevitable. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before Russia even knew war had been declared. The Russo-Japanese War had begun, enabled by the Anglo-Japanese alliance and triggered by Russia's broken promises in Manchuria. In December 1902, warships from three European powers, Britain, Germany, and Italy, imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela. European forces seized Venezuelan ships, bombarded coastal fortifications, and occupied customs houses to seize revenue directly. This was gunboat diplomacy in its classic form, using military force to extract financial payments from weaker nations. For decades, European powers had justified military interventions throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia by claiming they needed to protect their citizens and collect legitimate debts. But this time, European gunboats were operating in the Caribbean, territory the United States considered its sphere of influence. This was the first major test of United States hemispheric diplomacy under the Monroe Doctrine in the 20th century. The crisis would force America to define the limits of European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's president, Cipriano Castro, had risen to power through military force in 1899. His government faced constant internal rebellions and border conflicts with Colombia and British Guiana. Castro's priority was maintaining power, not fiscal responsibility. Venezuela owed significant debts to foreign creditors, bonds held by British, German, and Italian investors, plus claims for damages by foreign companies whose property had been seized or destroyed during Venezuelan civil conflicts. European governments demanded that Venezuela pay these debts and compensate their citizens for damages. Castro refused to pay under pressure, arguing that Venezuela's internal disorders made payment temporarily impossible. He offered to negotiate terms, but rejected European ultimatums. European powers responded with military force. In December 1902, British and German warships blockaded Venezuelan ports. Italian ships joined days later. European forces seized Venezuelan gunboats and customs houses. German ships bombarded Fort San Carlos on December 17, 1902. President Theodore Roosevelt initially took a nuanced position. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, stated that European powers could not colonize or interfere in independent American nations. But did the Monroe Doctrine prohibit European powers from collecting legitimate debts? Roosevelt believed it did not. If Latin American nations borrowed money, they had an obligation to repay. If they refused, creditors had a right to collect. The Monroe Doctrine prevented European colonization, but not debt collection. Roosevelt's Secretary of State, John Hay, informed European powers in December 1902 that the United States would not object to the Venezuelan blockade as long as it remained temporary and did not lead to permanent European occupation of Venezuelan territory. This was consistent with Roosevelt's broader philosophy of international responsibility. Roosevelt believed that nations, like individuals, had obligations. Borrowing money created a debt that must be repaid. Failure to repay justified enforcement action. German ships bombarded Fort San Carlos on December 17, 1902. German commanders claimed they had warned the fort to surrender, and that bombardment was necessary to enforce the blockade. But the bombardment alarmed American ally observers for two reasons. First, it escalated from financial pressure to military destruction. Seizing ships and customs revenue was one thing. Destroying Venezuelan military installations was another. The bombardment suggested Germany viewed the blockade not as temporary debt collection, but as a military operation that might lead to occupation. Second, Germany's aggressive approach triggered American suspicions about German intentions. Germany was rapidly building a navy designed to challenge British supremacy. Germany had colonial ambitions in the Pacific, Africa, and potentially the Caribbean. If Germany established a permanent presence in Venezuela, even under the guise of debt collection, it could threaten American interests throughout the Caribbean and Central America. American newspapers criticized the European blockade. Congress members demanded Roosevelt take action. Public opinion, particularly in the American South, viewed any European military presence in the hemisphere as a threat to American security. Roosevelt privately warned Germany that further escalation would not be tolerated. He moved American warships to Caribbean waters, not to confront European forces directly, but to signal American concern. Under American pressure, European powers agreed to submit debt claims to international arbitration. The Washington Protocols of February 1903 established terms. Venezuela would resume debt payments. European blockading powers would receive priority in repayment. The International Court of Arbitration at The Hague would resolve disputes over specific claims. European warships withdrew. The crisis ended without war. Venezuela resumed partial debt payments. The immediate confrontation was resolved. But Roosevelt drew a different lesson from the crisis, one that would reshape American foreign policy for the next 3 decades. If Latin American nations defaulted on debts, European military intervention would follow. The United States accepted this in 1902, allowing the Venezuelan blockade to proceed initially. But European intervention in the Caribbean created risks for American security. What if European powers used debt collection as a pretext for permanent occupation? What if temporary naval bases became permanent? What if European powers established colonies in the Caribbean under the guise of protecting their financial interests? Roosevelt concluded that the solution was preventing the situation that invited European intervention. If Latin American nations did not default, European powers would have no justification for military action. The way to prevent defaults was for the United States to manage Latin American finances directly. In December 1904, 2 years after the Venezuelan crisis, Roosevelt announced what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He declared that the United States would intervene in Latin American nations to prevent chronic wrongdoing or impotence that might require European intervention. The logic was simple. If a Latin American nation could not manage its finances, the United States would step in, taking control of customs houses, collecting revenues, paying foreign debts, and administering finances until stability was restored. This became the justification for systematic American intervention throughout the Caribbean and Central America. Between 1904 and 1934, the United States established customs receiverships in the Dominican Republic in 1905, Nicaragua in 1911, and Haiti in 1915. American Marines occupied Cuba from 1906 to 1909, 1912, and 1917 to 1922. They occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1925 and 1926 to 1933. They occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934 and the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. The Venezuelan crisis of December 1902 convinced Roosevelt that European powers would use debt collection as a justification for military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. His solution, American management of Latin American finances through customs receiverships, transformed the United States from a hemispheric power into a Caribbean empire. The crisis lasted only 2 months, but the logic Roosevelt developed during those 2 months defined American policy toward Latin America for the next generation.